Good afternoon, everybody. Afternoon, Scott. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I would like to introduce Scott Rasmussen. I hope I got that correct, this pronunciation, but Scott is the director of the Empire State Development's New York ConnectALL initiative here, the largest ever investment in New York's 21st century infrastructure. Prior to his work at ESD, Scott advised the US House of Representatives on telecommunication policy with an emphasis on development in rural and tribal communities. Scott also served as a founding board member of a community network in New York City and has direct experience planning and building wireless networks. So Scott, I'll hand it off to you. We're greatly appreciative of you giving up an hour of your time to help inform us on all the initiatives and all the funding opportunities that are existing at the moment. So I'll hand it off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending. I'm very sorry that I could not be there in person. My entire family came down with COVID last week, and I have been trying to manage a household and keep everything on track. So appreciate your patience, and I really hope that we find the opportunity to connect in person sometime in the future. I am going to try to share my screen for about a 15 to 20 minute PowerPoint presentation, just kind of going over what we're up to in New York State, the ConnectALL initiative, covering some of what got us here, and then would love to open it up to questions to be able to hear from everybody in the room what they're thinking about with respect to connectivity and thoughts about how we can better be partnering at the state level. So please, if you wouldn't mind letting me know if the screen share works. Can everyone see the presentation? Yes, maybe?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Great, great. All right, let's get started. How do we, my apologies. Now I'm showing my tech. There we go, slideshow. Sorry about that. Here we go. All right. So some of you may be familiar with the ConnectALL initiative. This is an incredibly exciting, I think, and new effort for New York State. We have been in the broadband game for many years, as I'm sure many folks in the audience are aware and familiar. But I think we're really embarking on an exciting new era in broadband nationally, with an incredible level of new attention from Congress, from the executive branch. President Biden was just holding a large conference with our vice president just last week, talking about broadband affordability. We are really at an inflection point. There has never been more focus, enthusiasm, and resourcing for broadband in US history, and we're really at the precipice to be able to do some incredible things, I think, across New York State, and I'm excited to share with you some of what we have in store. So to begin, what is the ConnectALL initiative? Our aim is for it to be a comprehensive plan to bring high-speed, affordable internet to all New Yorkers. Many may be familiar with the new New York Broadband program, which I will talk a little bit about in a moment, just get everybody onto the same page. But that was really focused on rural deployment in New York State. And we're going to continue doing that because there certainly are far too many New Yorkers that still don't have broadband available at their home. But we're expanding the scope. We're trying to think about broadband more comprehensively in new ways, and thinking about things like affordability, competition, innovation. How can we be setting the state up to be successful in 30 years from now with the investments that we're going to be making over the next couple of years? So altogether, I'll talk a little bit about the various funding streams we're putting in over what we expect $1 billion in public investment. That will also come with it, private investments that we're going to be seeking through matches or other types of forums to really transform our state's digital infrastructure, as I said, in a way that will set us up to be successful in the 21st century connected economy. Our initiative really focuses on 3 main areas. One, capital investments. I'm sure lots of the folks in the room here today know broadband is expensive. One of the reasons I think for so long, many politicians, particularly at the federal level, avoided broadband as an issue. I think we're somewhat unique in New York State with the new New York broadband program, is that folks want solutions to be easy. It's about mapping. It's about changing around permitting processes. And these are all great, important things to do. But at the end of the day, broadband is an incredibly expensive endeavor. And so our first kind of plank of our approach is through capital investments, putting, as I mentioned, over $1 billion of public funding into this initiative. Second, we need to leverage state assets. And what do I mean by that? We rolled back the DOT fiber fee in the recent budget that we passed this year. We need to streamline cellular siting. We need to in the budget this last year, and I'll talk about in a moment a bit more, authorizing NYPA, our New York State Power Authority, to be able to lease excess capacity. So what do we already have as a state? Public rights of ways, infrastructure, other types of things that we can leverage to spread broadband availability and access. And then finally, we need to be talking more about affordability and digital equity. What are the other barriers to access? It's certainly one thing if you have a fiber cable running in front of your house, that's great. That's a wonderful first step, but that does not mean that you have access. If you can't afford that connection, if you don't know how to use it, if you don't have experience or the devices in your home to be able to take advantage of it, that's certainly something we need to approach as well. So I'm particularly excited about this work because we're starting to think about broadband in a whole new way. And I think it's incredibly exciting and presents a lot of opportunity in the state. So a little bit to get us up to speed, where have we been? What have we been up to? Many of you are probably familiar with the new New York broadband program. We launched it in 2015. It was a $500 million investment in rural broadband deployment. At the time, it was by leaps and bounds the largest state broadband investment in the nation. As comparison, other states' broadband programs were usually around 5, 10, maybe $25 million, 25 million being a pretty large investment from a comparable state in the US. New York put $500 million into broadband in 2015 and 2016, which really accelerated deployment in the state. It really positioned us to be much more successful during the recent pandemic when folks were forced to work and learn from home. Obviously, there are still many gaps in the state. I'm the first to admit that. But without that $500 million investment, I can only imagine what the circumstances would be in many communities. How did we do this? We operated through public-private partnerships. We worked with 32 ISPs across the state to fund 126 projects. We ultimately were able to garner about $728 million in public and private investment. We deployed 21,000 miles of fiber. I think it's really important to recognize and understand that in the new New York broadband program, certainly we did put some funding into satellite and have received lots of criticism for that, but over 90% of our funding went into fiber infrastructure. Only 3% of our total funding went into satellite, and that was really in areas where we didn't receive any bids from a private wireline provider to be able to extend service. So our work ahead is going to be filling in those gaps. That's the first space that we're going to be focused on and what we'll be doing. To get a little bit more detail, new New York broadband program, we operated with what's called a reverse auction framework. We had 3 phases of funding. We really took the state, used the best data that we had available, and broke it up into served, underserved, and unserved communities or census blocks. We put those up for auction. The lowest bidder to serve that census block won, using with a priority for wireline service, of course, either fiber or cable. So this just gives a little overview of some of the past investments that we've had in rural broadband in the state. Before even the New York broadband program, we were investing in rural deployment as far back as 2012 with ConnectNY and support through our regional economic councils. We also, at the time, I'll talk about this in a moment, have a large state mandated build out by Charter Communications. And then just recently in October 2020, the FCC made awards for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That's lining up another $100 million of investments. Many of those projects haven't begun. Many of them have not even been finalized. That is going to be a much slower process, but certainly one to be aware of and tracking. So what else did we do in broadband previously? A big kind of boost to our efforts was our ability to have extracted important conditions on the merger of Time Warner Cable and Charter Communications. That those merger conditions included a requirement that Charter or the new Charter expand service to 145,000 previously unserved locations across New York State, increase speeds across the network, so 100 megabits per second in 2018, and then speeding up to 300 in 2019, and launching a statewide low-income program, Spectrum Assist, that was offering at the time, and now we need to be updating all of this, but nonetheless, high-speed internet for a much lower price than traditional offerings. The Public Service Commission is ultimately responsible for reviewing these merger conditions, so it's not in our office. So I'm happy to answer questions about this a little bit later, but please note that I'm certainly not the expert in all of this. So we work hand in hand with the Public Service Commission. I think the biggest thing to note is that Charter did report having finished its 145,000 locations in September, or maybe even August of last year, and they are under audit now. And so the Public Service Commission is very actively reviewing that with engineers in the field, likely as we speak. So looking forward, now catching up to ConnectALL and the work we have ahead. So we've focused for the last 6-7 years on rural broadband. And so what remains to be done? What do we need to be focusing on in the years ahead? As I mentioned, a key element of that is continuing to expand broadband access to unserved rural locations in the state. We have to finish the job once and for all and make sure that wireline broadband is available truly to all New Yorkers. But we also have to improve service and affordability by having a more competitive and robust broadband marketplace in the state. It is really our belief that just having one broadband option isn't sufficient. We should and can do better and need to be focusing our investments in ways to strategically do so. In my ideal world, right, everyone would have multiple competing private providers, maybe even municipal or other types of providers, competing for customers' monthly bills, and can compete with service improvements or affordability or a variety of other things. I think that's really where we're going to see success ultimately in the years ahead. And then we need to be building what we're describing as accessible and future-proof infrastructure. And by future-proof, I really mean fiber optics, since that really is the industry standard, the gold standard for future-proof infrastructure, at least as it's described now. And the goal there isn't just to extend broadband right to unserved households or to increase choice, but to be thinking about things like smart city innovations, to be thinking about economic development and bringing in folks into, bringing in new people into New York State, new jobs into New York State, new businesses, testing out innovative technologies, making sure that New York is at the cutting edge and that we're able to effectively compete in 20 years in a globalized marketplace. There is no doubt in my mind, even today, right, lack of access to high-speed broadband, and that means not only just consumer-focused broadband, but enterprise-level broadband for business development is necessary for economic growth and the success of our community in New York State. In 20 years, it's going to be all the more important. And we need to be making these investments now to make sure we're competitive then. So a little bit about some of the funding that we have for ConnectALL. I'm incredibly proud and excited to report that Governor Hochul was able to secure a $300 million state appropriation for broadband deployment in the recently passed budget. We have funding coming in from the American Rescue Plan Act that we're allocating towards broadband. That's another $345 million that we're investing in broadband infrastructure. Many of you, I'm sure, are very, very familiar with the infrastructure bill that was passed, IIJA. Actually, just today, we got the notice of funding opportunity was released regarding the broadband component of that language. I have not had the chance to read it, but certainly encourage everyone here to dig in over the weekend and the weeks to come to be able to understand more about how this important new funding source is going to impact New York State. There is also the Digital Equity Act, which is federal funding. It was included in the infrastructure bill. We also received that NOFO just today. Another thing to dig in on, but will certainly be a funding stream for years to come for investments of some of the digital equity issues that I will be talking about in just a moment. So what are we spending all this money on? What's the focus of this program? What do we have ahead? Part one, the number one kind of leading aspect of this program is capital investments. Spoke a little bit about this earlier, but broadband is expensive. We need to put our money where our mouth is and make these investments so that New York is set up to succeed in the years to come. And we're really thinking about these capital investments along four main programs. We have a local connectivity planning grant program that I am trying to get online as soon as humanly possible, likely by the end of summer. Don't quote me on that, but in the months ahead, we will certainly be coming out with this. This is going to be grants to municipalities to identify local broadband challenges, devise community solutions, and then actually have access to the technical assistance, the engineers, other types of resources needed to implement. It is truly my belief that local communities know best solutions for local broadband problems. We need to be empowering communities, municipalities, counties all across the state to be able to devise the solutions that will work for them. The solutions that are needed in Rochester or in any other area of the state are incredibly diverse and different. And we need to be thinking about that in new ways and empowering those communities to have the resourcing they need to solve those problems. So we are going to be kicking off this as the first aspect of our broadband programming to make sure that all of you have the resourcing you need to be successful. Then are the kind of larger, more meat and potato type programs that we have, one of which is a 21st century municipal infrastructure investment program. That is grants to municipalities to construct fiber or conduit or other types of capital investments to build public infrastructure, public broadband infrastructure, things like open access networks that can be leased to multiple private providers, a variety of different approaches to trying to, really turn the ship in New York State to make sure that broadband is accessible to all. We're also going to be investing in a rural broadband grant program, continuing the work that we did in the new New York broadband program by issuing matching grants to extend broadband services even further into the most hard to reach areas of the state. A little bit about that, to just go into more details. I imagine this is certainly an issue of great interest to everyone here. Many may be familiar with the forthcoming broadband availability maps that we've been working on at the state level. We are expecting those to come out quite soon. It will give a whole new level of granular detail at the address level about where broadband is and is not available. We think this is going to be an incredibly powerful data source for finally being able to identify exactly what households in the state don't have broadband access and come up with solutions to be able to make sure that they do in the future. And so this rural broadband grant program will really take that data, run with it to be able to get the capital investments that we need to be able to extend those services. And then finally, we're going to have an innovation fund. This is a grant program really focused around kind of out-of-the-box thinking on broadband, things that don't clearly fall into these categories. This could be funding for innovative approaches to deployment and affordable housing. This could be cellular projects in particularly hard to reach areas and looking for kind of third party or neutral host solutions to cellular. These are kind of smaller grants, community-based broadband projects, wireless projects, or other smaller grants, but certainly things that start poising us to really leverage these capital investments in broadband and try to look into new models for how to deploy broadband in the state. Then we're focused on affordability and equity, right? To begin, if you are not familiar with the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is administered through the FCC, and we have been focused on getting New Yorkers enrolled in, please get up to speed with it and learn and share the information with your community. This is a $30 a month subsidy for low-income New Yorkers or low-income Americans generally. $30 subsidy on either home broadband or a cellular bill. We have about 800,000 New York households now enrolled in the program. There are over 2 million New York households that are eligible. We need to get more folks enrolled in this program, as I'm sure I don't have to explain to anyone in the room what $30 a month off of the plan could mean. And particularly, for example, Charter is now offering a low-income program at $29.99 a month to those who are eligible for this program. It essentially translates to free high-speed home internet, which is really an opportunity we need to be pushing out and spreading awareness on. So that's one focus of our efforts. We're also looking at affordable housing and connectivity and affordable housing. We're partnering with our friends at HCR to try to do assessments about where is broadband and affordable housing, what kind of improvements or retrofits may be necessary. And then we're also starting up a digital equity program here at ESB. It is, the position is on our website for a state digital equity director. If anybody has recommendations, would love to have your candidates or recommendations for that. We're going to put together a statewide digital equity plan that really focuses on disadvantaged communities, rural communities, communities of color, low-income communities, veteran communities, others, and mapping out what are the needs that those or unique obstacles that those communities face, and what do we have to be doing as a state to make sure that they're getting online. Following our plan, we will be setting up a grant program to support nonprofits or others engaged in supporting these communities with kind of digital inclusion programs, digital literacy, things of that nature. And then finally, I mentioned leveraging state assets. So some of what we're up to, we repealed the DOT fiber fee in the recent budget. We authorized NYPA to lease excess capacity on its own fiber network. We have 1,400 miles of transmission lines across New York State, much of which has fiber associated with it. NYPA doesn't need all that fiber capacity, so we should be leasing it out to partners, whether the municipalities or private partners, to take advantage of that middle mile network to be able to further deploy. We should standardize right-of-way access, make it simpler and easier for private companies and others to be able to build, and then work and partner with local communities to try to get cellular siting rules set up that really facilitate the deployment of things like 5G or other advanced next generation technologies. That is my presentation. I am, as I mentioned at the start, amazingly excited for the opportunities that we have ahead. I am fired up about it. I certainly hope that everybody in this room is excited about what these investments could mean for New York State and for our communities and the people that we all represent. With that, I would be more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Would anyone have questions for
Scott, can you hear me?
I can.
Scott, you were mentioned satellite, and I noticed you alluded to kind of a pushback. Now with Starlink, I come from a county that's big in agricultural, so running fiber out to some of our people is not really financially the way to go. But I noticed they're using Starlink in Ukraine, where there's a war zone. I think we could use it here in an agricultural area. But what is can you expand more on the pushback?
Sure. Starlink is a new development in kind of the satellite internet game. And, you know, it is, I would say, a not fully tested technology. And by that, I mean, you know, Starlink has really, it remains in the beta phase. I want to say, you know, we're certainly in communication with Starlink. I want to say that there's between 8,000 and 10,000, maybe a couple more. This is a little bit out of date, but 8,000 or 10,000 kind of households in New York State that are currently using Starlink. I think there's a lot of questions once you start increasing that to 80,000 or 100,000 households in New York State, whether the systems really has the capacity. But going back to kind of satellite previously, you know, there is no doubt in my mind that in many cases, past generation satellite technologies are not sufficient to be competitive and have kind of ubiquitous access to high-speed internet. You really need a terrestrial solution in almost all cases. I mean, even in the agricultural sector, this is something that the FCC has been looking at a lot. You know, precision agriculture and some of the work that's going on and being able to manage some of the technology and vehicles and other types of things used in precision agriculture really requires high-speed internet. And by that, I mean, you know, 100 megabits per second or above internet service to really take advantage of those technologies and be able to deploy them well. I am quite confident that we are going to be very close to getting universal fiber or wireline broadband in New York State. It's certainly a tall order. It's a big goal. But as just to give kind of a perspective, in the new New York broadband program, we were funding households at about $6,000 to $8,000 was probably the average by the end of our program. $6,000 to $8,000 a household is what the state was spending to be able to deploy technology. That really gets you down to, you know, to put that into perspective, broadband deployment in the state in some rural areas where it can be particularly challenging is typically around $30,000 a mile to put in fiber infrastructure, you know, plus or minus some miles more expensive than others, but probably on average about $30,000 a mile. So if you imagine we were investing about $6,000 to $8,000 a mile, that's talking about 5 homes per mile. That's the level of, that's just how far kind of our investments were able to get previously. I bet by the time we're through the money that we're going to be investing in rural deployment in the state in the years ahead, I bet we're going to be to $10,000 to $15,000 a premise in broadband deployment. That's looking at starting to be, you know, 2 or 3 households per mile. That's getting pretty far out there, and I think going to be reaching a lot of the communities that you may be talking about. Does that help? Kind of it's a long answer, but I hope helpful and to give context.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
Next question.
I will say Starlink has great potential. It's exciting. There's a lot of potential there. You know, I think we're still poised in a little bit of a wait and see position about this. This is exciting. This could be great. This could mean a lot of access and support for New Yorkers, but that doesn't mean that we need to take our foot off the gas with respect to trying to deploy fiber optics to every New Yorker.
Scott, a question. In terms of fixed wireless, under the IIJA, is that looking like, or is that an eligible approach to utilize those funds?
The NOFO came out just this morning. So it is out there, and everyone here can now finally, I think, see what they mean. Based on not having read it myself, but based on what I have read about others reading it, there is a strong preference for fiber. I don't think that that means that fixed wireless is ruled out in any case, but my understanding is likely that you would have to make a pretty good argument as to why fixed wireless is the only kind of approach that's going to be effective in some areas. And so I think there will be a strong preference for wireline service. And in cases where it doesn't line up, we may have that flexibility, but we're going to have to make a really solid case as to why that's the appropriate approach.
Thank you. Questions from the room?
People seem less excited about broadband. I don't know, maybe it's just that I'm here on my computer, but I certainly hope everybody in the room is looking forward to the opportunity that we have and excited to get engaged on these issues, because there is a lot of opportunity here, and not only to get broadband deployed to all communities, but to really do things differently, to think outside of the box and develop programs that, you know, maybe meeting needs now, but will be meeting needs in 30 years as well.
Could you hear that, Scott?
I did not, no, I'm sorry.
Is this broadband system in competition with Comcast, Time Warner, Spectrum? Or is it in addition to, or just another alternative?
Sure, I think I have no doubt that so Charter will very likely be a partner in some of this work. That does not mean that they're the only partner in the game. As I mentioned, in the New York broadband program, we worked with 32 private providers. Some of those were small family businesses. That also included Verizon and expanding Verizon Fios in the state. So I fully expect that, at least on the rural deployment side of things, we're going to continue those types of partnerships. That may mean, right, Spectrum, Charter, if they are at the end of the road, they stop here on a road, but there's 5 people further down the road that need access to cable services, we certainly may be partnering with Charter to try to just extend that broadband line a little bit further to get folks high-speed home access. There's lots of cases like that all across the state, I think, and so we're going to be inviting, you know, partnerships with anyone, any private provider that's capable of doing so, to join with us. But that's also why we're setting up this municipal broadband program. You know, we're trying to think ways to add more competition into the environment, that there's not just going to be one, you know, local provider that kind of provides services, dictates the price, the service quality, and all of that. And so we really see kind of investments in municipal infrastructure, public broadband infrastructure as being one way to try to stimulate more competition in that space. Municipality, for example, could build out fiber infrastructure and lease it to multiple private providers or others to be able to provide end user service. So there's a lot of different models there, but I think we're really focused on working with anyone in the state that is committed to trying to get folks online and finding a way to be able to form those partnerships.
Thanks, Scott. Questions? Scott, you raised around the work that the Public Service Commission had contracted with ECC Technology and others to create an understanding of the existing infrastructure and, you know, provide, you know, a survey for communities and residents to fill in. You said it's, you know, it should be due shortly. Do you have any, will they meet their end of May kind of deadline that was outlined when the act was passed, or will communities potentially have to wait a little bit longer than that? Do you have any insight that you're able to share?
I don't want to speak, I don't want to speak for them, but I know that they have said repeatedly they're going to get this out in the spring and that they're very committed to doing so. I'm in communication with them on a near daily basis about these matters. and they are very close to being able to get this online. So, you know, it's now kind of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure the user interface works, things like that. But it's really, we are in the end game on that, and I expect it to be available sooner rather than later.
Thanks. In terms of the municipal grants that your office is developing, you know, we thank you for joining with us today to pass on the knowledge that you have. Will the office be providing webinars to help educate communities, municipalities on what, you know, the more detail on what the purpose of the grants are and how best to apply for them?
Absolutely. So I had spoken a little bit about this local broadband planning grant program that we're standing up. You know, that's the way to give a little bit more detail and a peek under the hood with respect to kind of where we're heading with that. We're really thinking about it as a two-part process. One is, you know, I am of the belief that the solutions to broadband is really, you know, going to look different in every community, and that local communities are best suited to understand what their needs are and what the best approach to solve them is. I truly believe that. I don't think that I know better than anybody in this room the communities that they represent and the problems that they face. And so, you know, our big goal in that program is to get adequate resourcing to local communities to have the capacity, the means, the technical assistance to be able to do so. So my perspective is kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom, let every community in the state get access to funding to be able to do this. And so I think it's really going to play out in two parts. One, we're going to try to put out some money for local broadband needs assessments. Those will be relatively small grants, you know, likely tens of thousands of dollars or somewhere in that world, you know, $100,000, but someplace in that, you know, smaller level. And that will be, you know, funding to be able to develop a local broadband needs assessment. And in conjunction with that, we're going to be leading a series of seminars about broadband planning, broadband access, how to analyze data, how to take advantage of grant programs, and try to put together some real coursework where communities can kind of get a representative to get up to speed on broadband, really become local experts in that space. So that's kind of phase one, is going to be an educational component matched with funding and support for a needs assessment. Phase two of that program, as we really see it, is the next level. So, right, actualizing those plans. Communities put together a vision statement of what they think needs to happen. Again, that may look radically different in every community. In some, it may be, we had students learning from home that didn't have access to a device. We need to come up with a way to get devices in this community and make sure that those are, you know, matched with our library system or school system to get them in the hands of young people. It may be broadband isn't available to most folks, and we need to continue building out rural broadband. It may be broadband's not affordable. There could be a variety of different things that are understood in those needs assessments and kind of the vision for trying to get, you know, what steps need to be taken. The phase two of our local planning grants, the goal is that those are larger grants that are going to largely give folks access to consultants, technical assistance, things of that nature, to kind of put together an engineering plan. What's the plan look like? Get the real details down on paper for what needs to be done, so that every community is now armed with basically an off-the-shelf grant proposal, a engineering plan, whatever it is that they identify as being needed to be able to be successful, to be able to leverage some of the bigger pots of funding. And so that's kind of how we see that first component of the local planning grants playing out over time. You know, I think we really see it as that our success is tied to your success in this, and we're not gonna be successful as a state unless that we have real buy-in and expertise at the local level.
I have a question. How does this affect existing franchise agreements that cable companies have with local and state and countywide facilities?
Great question.
Right right now
None.
are really crowded with underground
Well,
infrastructure.
that is certainly so. I guess describe what you mean by a crowded right of way.
All right.
Not like inadequate space on a pole.
What did you just say? You want to repeat?
You hear us, Scott?
I can't hear it now. Yeah.
Okay. Did you hear the question I had about franchise agreements and
I did.
crowded,
I did.
utility usage of right of ways? And does the
So I'm curious on the crowded utility space, if you can just elaborate a little bit what you mean by that. There's no space on a pole, or what's the kind of
well, in a rural
circumstance?
community, they might go aerial, I'm sure, but in a residential application, you have joint trench with gas, electric, telephone, and some cable, some fiber optics. In order to be standalone and have it protected, you'd want to bury it underground in these facilities. Once that happens, if it's in a town right away or municipal right away, there needs to be some kind of franchise agreement underneath the Transportation Act.
Yep, got it. So, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So our program, the new New York broadband program really we didn't even recognize franchise agreements. We have lots of cases where we paid, for example, TDS to build out, and we forced every provider to build out to our standards, whether or not they had a franchise agreement in that area, and if they ended up winning the ultimate bid. And so, we kind of see internet as being different. It's not a cable service. You need to extend it to where it's needed. If you put in a bid to extend that service, you need to be able to do so. So in more rural contexts, I don't kind of see franchise boundaries or things of that nature as playing in too much. In more urban or suburban areas where, as you mentioned, there's kind of a crowded utility space. This is something that we have thought a lot about. That is the goal of municipal grant program, right? Those are the communities that will be served. Those communities ostensibly already have access to at least one wireline broadband service provider today. So, and that's who's occupying that right-of-way space. I see a big part of the municipal investment program as aiming to put more conduit in the ground. That is one of the biggest barriers to, right? That's what makes it so costly for a new provider to enter a space, is tearing up a lot of streets, trying to put that in. And if you're doing that for every time that there's somebody new entering the market, it's a waste of money. It's a waste of time and energy in it. And so I would love to give funding to municipalities to be able to put conduit in the ground that supports a more competitive fiber market in those communities. And I think that that's one of the big elements that we're trying to focus on, is really expanding access to the right of way and be able to put more conduit in the ground. Where that's not possible, then we got to think about some out of the box solutions. That could look like fixed wireless in some communities if that's an avenue that they'd like to pursue. Certainly 5G technology is to a point where, you can, if there's fiber backhaul in an area, we could put in some relatively smaller towers that may deploy, or other types of solutions. Does that help at all in answering the question?
Yes, it does.
Great.
Scott, I realized that you have yet, the NOFO only came out today, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and there's always a lot of, information to get, in the detail, and how it all, from the state's point of view, how to move forward. But you outlined, the planning grants for municipalities to, help understand their existing environment, where their gaps are, some potential solutions moving forward. Did you outline at the start earlier on that funding would come available potentially around the end of summer? Did I hear that correct?
That's the goal. That is, if all things go well in my world, yes, we are going to get that funding online by end of summer.
For those communities that are a little bit further ahead and kind of have have been putting the work in the past. The funding opportunities for more of those capital projects, when do you see that coming online? Will that come, be broken up into phases, or will you wait off until every, the feeling is that the majority of communities have an understanding of what they need?
A lot of that is dependent on federal timelines, right? So we have our state appropriation in that, but we want to leverage that state appropriation with federal funds. Bigger programs make it go farther, right? The NOFO that came out today regarding kind of the rural deployment, it's called the BEAD program, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. BEAD, that's the NOFO that came out today. We will get likely $5 million to do kind of planning and administrative purposes at the state level for the next while. We then have to put together a 5-year action plan for how we kind of envision broadband deployment in the state. And then we have to wait on the FCC maps to be complete, which is not going to happen until later this year before we get a funding allocation. So that rural deployment bucket of money that is in part coming from the feds, is in part coming with state money, is unlikely to go online before spring 2023. In all honesty, I think we'd love it to happen faster, but unfortunately, that's kind of the federal timelines that we're operating under. If we can make it happen faster, that'll be great, but it's really going to depend on when these FCC maps come together and a host of other things. Some of the other kind of bucket of money there being the municipal grant funding. I want to get that set up as soon as I can. We're based on some federal timelines on that as well, the next of which is late September. And then that should hopefully open up some of the money to be able to come into the state before the end of 2022. So looking at October, November, and then we'd have to be able to come out with an RFP to issue that money. So in all honesty, we're probably looking at those larger grant programs coming online late 2022, spring or even summer 2023, depending on some of the rural aspects and what the feds are doing. So it will be a slow process, unfortunately, but we're trying to get things set up as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Scott.
Yep.
Any more questions from the floor? I see none. Do you have any other thoughts come up, Scott, that you would like to pass on to the audience?
Sure. Just in closing, and I'm hopeful that we can get this rolling with the kind of local planning grants that we're setting up. This is in the kind of broadband and connectivity space. This is the once in the generation opportunity. There will never be, well, who knows if never, but there will likely never be another investment of this magnitude in digital infrastructure in New York State. I am just trying to encourage everyone that's thinking about broadband, doing planning, to think creatively and think differently, because we certainly can just cut a check to a local broadband provider to expand access. That's something that we know how to do. We have done that well in the New York broadband program. It'll certainly be something that we continue to do to be able to expand deployment to some unserved and underserved locations. But I really encourage everybody to take this opportunity and think differently and creatively about what they want broadband to look like in their community 30 years down the road, and to take advantage of this opportunity and the funding that we have available to really set our communities up for success in 20 or 30 years. Because as I mentioned, municipalities are going to be the leaders in this space. They are going to be the leaders in these grant programs. And so I really hope that folks kind of zero in and start thinking about, what they would like to see and do big picture thinking to try to actualize it.
Thank you.
With that, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for taking time to join us here. I hope yourself and your family are well and improving, and I'm sure we look forward to seeing how communities, municipalities can work with the state to fill the gaps in our broadband infrastructure moving forward. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Much appreciated.